Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the fourth European Online Alumni Seminar. And this afternoon, we're discussing Back to the Future of Europe, drawing lessons from the EU experience since 1989. And we've got a top-flight panel of experts who write about, think about, teach about the history of the European Union and its potential future development. This is the fourth of our seminars. We started in January with Trump 2, Implications for America, Europe, and the World. We continued in April with Defending Europe Now, What is to be Done? And then in July, How to Get a Job in the EU institutions and How Not to Get a Job. So today we're looking at the European Union in historical context. How has it evolved? How can it evolve? And how should it evolve now to step up to the massive challenges which are faced by our continent in this era of Trump, Putin, and Xi? This seminar will explore what the European Union has got right, what it's got wrong, and how it could have handled some things better in the 36 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. And the first of those who's going to share their thinking on this is Professor Desmond Dinan, professor and John Monnet's chair at George Mason University in Virginia. He's also been a professor at the College of Europe in Bruges and in Nattelin, and author of several books on the political institutions and institutional history of the European Union: Europe Recast, Ever Closer Union, and the European Union in Crisis. Thank you very much for joining us, Desmond. Over to you.
Anthony, thank you for the invitation. It's wonderful to be here, and it's a great pleasure to be a panelist with such distinguished colleagues, Professor Patel, dear Kiran, and Dr. Rusak, dear Sophia. And I will mention straight away that Sophia and I recently co-authored an article in the Journal of Common Market Studies, so we've worked closely together. Anthony, I'm going to begin by saying unequivocally and unashamedly that the European Union has been a huge success and that it remains a huge success. It's easy to overlook that because the European Union faces so many problems, and I'm sure we're going to get into those today. And I would not deny that the EU faces challenges and problems, but I think it's important to put the EU in perspective and to put its achievements in perspective. And I was reminded of this when I looked at the description of today's event, because you allude to the power of China and Russia and the United States. In comparison, the EU looks better and better every day. Let's put aside China and Russia for obvious reasons. But unfortunately, if you look at what's happening in the United States today, and I'm very familiar with that because I live there, although I happen to be in Brussels at the moment, but we see increasing illiberalism, we see social splintering, we see political dysfunctionality, we see an incipient, in fact, perhaps a real constitutional crisis, and an economy that's very fragile. And the fragility of the American economy, I think, is disguised by the AI bubble. Now, that's a separate discussion, I know, but I'm simply suggesting that it's very easy to overlook the strengths of the EU, perhaps because we are dazzled by the apparent success of the United States. Now, another point of comparison, which is very difficult, and by the way, perhaps one should not compare the European Union with sovereign states, I know that, but another point of comparison which is equally difficult because it involves counterfactuals is what might Europe look like today without the European Union? And I would suggest that it would, of course, be a very different Europe, be a weaker Europe, be a more fragmented Europe. So I think we owe a lot, and we will get into this, I know, this afternoon, to the European Union. In fact, I will talk about one of the achievements of the European Union, which I think has been singular and so important, and that is enlargement in just a minute. But let me first pick up again on your description of the discussion today, because I was intrigued by the way you suggested that the European Union is weak relative to these other countries, and you describe those other countries by their leadership. You refer to the leadership of Putin, of Xi, and of Trump. And I think it's important to say that, and this might be a weakness or a strength of the European Union will never have a leader comparable to those leaders. I hope not. But what I'm getting at is really that the leadership in the European Union cannot produce one person of that stature even if that person were to be a benign leader, which we hope that person would, because the European Union has been designed in a certain way to prevent strong leadership. Now, I don't want to tread on Sophia's toes because she'll talk about perhaps leadership in the Commission, but I'm referring more broadly to the way in which leadership is structured in the European Union. And leadership in the European Union is deliberately organized in a collective fashion so that one institutional leader or indeed one national leader cannot dominate and and cannot overshadow the others. And I'm referring to the collective leadership of the European Council. Now, of course, the Commission President is a member. The European Council has its own president, but that office, important though it is, and I would say that one of the most important institutional developments in European integration in recent years has been the strengthening of the European Council and the introduction of a full-time president. But even that office was not designed to become a president in the presidential sense of the European Union or indeed of the European Council. And even within the European Council, if you look at its principal members, who are the national members, and some members, by virtue of the countries they represent, perhaps are more influential than others. One can think of the leader of France, the leader of Germany, and jointly, when it works, Franco-German leadership. But again, the design is not to have a predominant single national leader or joint national leadership. And that might seem to be an inherent weakness of the European Union, but I think, in fact, it's part of the strength of the European Union. And we have to remember the nature of the European Union: 27 separate sovereign states willing to share sovereignty to an extent, but not to the extent of endowing any single person with the kind of leadership that could be comparable internationally to that of, let's say, the leader of China, the leader of Russia, or the leader of the United States. So the collective leadership of the European Union within the European Council is, I think, a singular, unique feature of the European Union, and I think it's been very successful for the European Union. It has been tested in recent years, especially by a series of crises, and we can talk about how the European Union fared during each of these crises. But I think without the European Council, without its standing president, without a strong Commission president within the European Council, the European Union would have been much worse off than it was. So that's one point I wanted to make about the nature of leadership and the collective leadership in the European Union. The other point, opening introductory point I would like to make, and this comes back to the measuring, if you like, or evaluating the achievement of the European Union. I'd like to touch briefly on enlargement. Because when you think of what distinguishes the European Union as an entity, there are so many features of it in its history, its institutional structure, its organization. But a very distinctive feature of the European Union is that it is bound to enlarge. Now, this distinguishes the European Union, of course, from countries, some of which may have irredentist tendencies, but I'm talking about the fact that the European Union, by virtue of being European, is bound to enlarge and accept applications from countries that are European and that accept the values of the European Union, of course. Now, what is European is a big question. We can discuss that too. But almost every country within Europe that seeks to join the European Union and that meets the basic criteria of being European and being democratic and the basic economic criteria is indeed entitled to apply. And though most of those that want to join have applied. And enlargement has been a feature of European integration since the beginning of the European community, almost, but certainly throughout the existence of the European Union as the European Union, I mean, since 1993. And so enlargement is a very distinctive policy field because it involves the foreign policy of the European Union towards particular countries. And the objective of that policy is to bring those countries in as members. No country has a foreign policy like that. It is for the European Union a very, not only is it a distinctive policy field, but it's a very challenging policy field because enlargement is time consuming, it's highly technical, it can be politically fraught, it involves an enormous investment of capital, political capital, and it has a major impact, obviously, on the acceding countries, but on the European Union itself. And yet, the European Union has dealt with this challenge of enlargement, as I said, almost continuously since its existence. And the major and most obvious achievement of enlargement has been to bring in the countries of Central and Eastern Europe. And I think that we should always bear that in mind when we think about the achievements of the European Union over the last 30 years, because that has been a phenomenal achievement. The European Union is grappling today with enlargement challenges, Ukraine, Moldova, of course, and the application for membership in Ukraine finally obliged, if you like, the European Union, and here I would say the European Council, to think more seriously about the enlargement prospects of the countries in the Western Balkans. And we know from the most recent Commission assessments that two of those countries, Macedonia and Albania, are front runners for membership. That said, I know that there is no appetite for enlargement within the European Union, and the term enlargement fatigue is often thrown about. But my point is that enlargement has always been on the agenda. It is still on the agenda. And on the whole, the European Union's management of enlargement policy, I think, has been successful. And if you look at the development, the economic development of countries in Central and Eastern Europe, and indeed I would say countries in the Western Balkans in anticipation of enlargement, we can see just how successful that policy has been. Again, I'm not in any way dismissing the challenges or some of the problems that have come with enlargement, but I think it's important, at least at the beginning of this discussion, to see the big picture. Why don't I leave it at that? And I look forward to the remarks of my colleagues and to the discussion to follow.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Desmond, for setting the scene so well. I'm going to pass straight over to Kiran Patel. He's Professor of Modern History and Chair of the Project Europe House at Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich, which is one of the member universities of the Europeum. He was previously Professor at Maastricht and at the European University Institute in Florence. And he's the author of a really fascinating book called Project Europe, A History. So, Kiran, how do you see it?
Thank you, first of all, Anthony, for inviting me to this panel. It's fantastic to be here, again, wherever that here is, somewhere in Brussels, in the internet or wherever. Fantastic to also be on this panel together with Sophia. Nice to meet you. And with Des, we've done many things also in the past. So it's fantastic to see you again. And again, also great to see how active and lively European discussions are. And great that so many of you have joined for this afternoon. Now, as a historian, I think it is really very useful to go back and also look at these last 3-4 decades and see how the European Union has evolved. And I have to share bad news with you because I think that a lot of the general things that I want to say are somewhat similar to what Dinan has just said a second ago. So I'm also starting with a rather optimistic note. And I would like to say, and this is the first half of my argument, that since the late 1980s, I think one should say the European Union has done many things right. Firstly, and most importantly, it has grown so much. And it's not just because of enlargement and leadership as two dimensions that we've already heard, but also because it has acquired so many new dimensions and has become such a much more important creature, if you will, than ever before. So if we just think of the European communities of the early 1980s or the 1970s, or even further back into the 60s and 50s, I think if we still had communities of that kind and not go to the full counterfactual that we just had a second ago, even if we had that community of the 1980s still today, there would be little reason to have this Zoom conversation this afternoon, because it would have remained a rather technical entity in charge of a common market, an overblown agriculture policy and a couple of other things. And it is really the period since maybe not just 89, I would argue since the 1970s and particularly the mid-1980s, that the European Union has started to become the entity that it is today, i.e. that it has so many powers in different policy fields that it can really change the trajectory of societies in member states and beyond, that it makes a difference for better and for worse, as we've seen over the past years. So I would argue that this period that we have as starting point, the 1980s, is something one could call the second foundation of European integration after the obvious starting point in the 1950s. Where again, what we had is a new direction that was taken. I would argue that what we have is a strong period of liberalization. And with this term, I would like to summarize many different things. I want to highlight 5 that I find particularly important. Which also speaks to broader tendencies in member states and beyond Europe also that are characteristic for the period of the time. So firstly, what we have at the technical level of the European communities and slash European Union is the move from the common to the single market. 2 words that sound really technical. Any PR expert would say this was fantastic splash because nobody can really say what the difference is. It is a nice way of summarizing that we want to overcome the remaining obstacles to market integration, and that splash worked remarkably well in convincing member states to really do something that they had been reluctant to do in the first 2-3 decades of European integration, to do away with these non-tariff barriers to market integration that had become a big obstacle by the time. So what we see is an unleashing of market forces, which certainly was an important dimension of creating new prosperity in the member states, of course also leading to new inequalities in member states and beyond, but still it certainly comes from, if you look at this from an institutional perspective, strengthened the powers of the European community / European Union tremendously. And if you think about liberalization and the gospel of prosperity, the euro, of course, comes to mind, which also has an important starting point in the 1980s, then into the 1990s, where there were many moments when this project could have died, if you will. And it is then only in the 1990s that it becomes real and then a currency in the 2000s. So it's again this exact period where the idea to use a common currency as a second heart chamber, if you will, next to the common market to push for further forms of European integration when this becomes a new reality. Sorry. There is something there that I would like to mention, which is Schengen. Again, firstly, something that is institutionally outside of the institutions of the European community, but then also increasingly integrated, the idea of free movement, at least among citizens of the member states, and an opening up of internal borders and boundaries. And that certainly was also in the same spirit of liberalization, in this sense, again, with a strong economic driver, but also beyond the field of the economy. Enlargement has already been mentioned, so I can keep this short. I think, again, speaks to the same kind of idea and has also helped to make the European Union then so much more important than it had been in earlier periods. And lastly, fifthly, I just want to summarize all the other immense developments that have shaped European integration since the 1980s. Again, inroads and also elaboration on many more policy fields that go beyond the economy, basically, be it on citizenship, be it on the environment, be it on so many other issues, more recently also digitalization and so on. Having said that, I would argue that what is characteristic for this period, that the economy was in the driver's seat. And that is 2 things. On the one hand, that economic policies broadly conceived, including the euro and monetary integration, for instance, were the most important dimensions of European integration. And secondly, I would argue that the economy played an important role because whatever the problem was, the European Union had the tendency to treat them as problems to be solved by economic means. Let me just remind you of the pandemic, again, with the European Union in 2020, which had little powers in the field and tried to do many things. But the most important, single most important measure, I think, was Next Generation EU. Again, this 750 billion euros budget, where again, it was not about fighting the virus, but rather fighting the political, particularly the economic and social consequences of the crisis, of the pandemic. And again, it was an attempt with very new means, with own debts, to overcome the crisis at the time. So in that sense, I think, again, it is worth looking back these 3, 4 decades, because the European Union that we have today owes so much to the period that we're discussing here. Now, coming to the last 2, 3 minutes, I would like to say that, of course, we're now living in a very different context. And if we started with the more happy news, let me bring in a little bit of doom and gloom. Of course, what we see across the globe is that multilateralism is in crisis, that we have a stagnation of globalization, that there is new security threats. I would agree with Dinan that, again, I would rather live in the European Union than in any of the other major players that we've discussed here. But I think what we also see is that the European Union resembles something which, in a metaphoric way, reminds me of a football player who is really extremely professional playing football and has been training to play football, i.e. being a major economic player for all their life, now being exposed to a rugby field, right? Where the game has different rules, where there are rules, maybe, but it's much more robust, it's much more muscular, it's very different, and where power play and again, military dimensions play a much more important role than the du commerce, to say with Montesquieu, the idea that trade basically and economic links should be the role of the game. So I think that therefore we need to look back also from that perspective. But again, there is this wonderful title for the session, Back to the Future. And some of you might know that movie from 1985, which was certainly inspiring Anthony or the team when they were thinking about the title, where there is a machine called the flux capacitor, which is basically a time machine that can take you back to the early periods, basically. Now, if we had a chance to go back to the mid-80s, say, I think there is rather little that could have been done differently, because if one is realistic of what the European Union was created for, where its powers lied, what the member states wanted and were willing to do, I think, there were mistakes, obviously, but nothing very fundamental could have been done differently. But again, in the new environment that we find ourselves in, probably it's really time to think very creatively of what should come. And I would just like to make 3 points here. I think, firstly, the European Union should use its strengths, that is, the economic DNA, also to face the new challenges, including the new security challenges. And if we talk about armament policies, procurement, and so on, the European Union has started to play a major role also over the past 2 or 3 years, which was quite improbable and inconceivable for most just 5 years ago. So I think that is also, in a new environment, what the European Union can do. Secondly, I think one should also see, again, strengths of the European Union when it comes to market integration, where, again, not just policies in the positive sense of creating new policies, but maybe also reconsidering existing policies is in order, i.e. deregulation of certain kind of policies when it comes, for instance, to security dimensions, and again, unleashing the economic potential that we need to unleash, given the challenges with a more, problematic global environment, whilst not forgetting, of course, also environmental concerns in this new world. Last point, and with this I will conclude, I think what we also need, finally, is a new conversation about an international division of labor of forums. What do I mean with this? For the longest time, NATO had been in charge of security. In the Cold War, it was clear that European Union could basically be in a cocon, secured from security issues, because NATO was running the shop. In the post-Cold War period, there was a much lower threat perception, i.e. NATO was still around, but there was less perceived need, at least, for security issues. What we now have is a crisis of NATO, and particularly of transatlantic relations. Now, the real question, I think, is if the European Union is able to step up and replace what NATO has done so far. I find that quite unlikely, I have to say, for many reasons. Let me just mention 2 or 3. One of them being the composition of member states, which is not just about the United Kingdom and Norway not being part of the European Union, but also some neutral countries being in the European Union, where coming up with a security policy that is meaningful, I think, will be extremely difficult. Secondly, that NATO is still around. And again, in many ways, Europeans will continue to have strong transatlantic links. If you just think about armament policies and, for instance, fighter planes, F-35s, there is no way how all these links can be replaced by tomorrow. So in that sense, I think whether with the United States, if possible, or without the United States, but there is still Canada and other places, there should be a new discussion about a division of labor where the more economic dimensions, in line with the DNA of the European integration process since the 1950s and even more so since the 1980s, should remain in the hands of the European Union. But one should also think what realistically could be done in other forums, and that might imply a NATO without the United States. But where I'm not a fan of discussions about creating a European army, because I don't think that they are particularly realistic when it comes to turning the European Union into a full-fledged military and security actor. Maybe I'll end there. I hope this is enough kind of for the discussion. And with that, over to Sophia. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kiran. That was really terrific. And Sophia, I'm going to invite her to come in just a second. She's Research Fellow at the Centre for European Policy Studies, CEPS, the premier think tank in many ways in Brussels. And she's been rapporteur of the CEPS SWP Working Group on EU Democracy. She writes on the politics of the European Commission and the political dynamics of the European Parliament. And congratulations in order because she recently obtained her doctorate. Over to you, Sophia.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the kind introduction, Anthony, and Desmond and Kiran. Thank you very much for your very interesting inputs. In some ways, I can connect to that, and in some ways, I'm going to take you all into the nerdy weeds of interinstitutional dynamics, because indeed, I just finished my PhD this year, where I looked at politicization, presidentialization of the European Commission, and as this topic is, getting not less topical, I thought it might be nice to give a little, to share my views on the institutional development of the European Commission as the core executive institution of the EU, being, really at the heart of the institutional system of the EU, and being, really in transformation from what used to be a technocratic institution to a increasingly political institution. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how the Commission has developed and why it matters. And I know the drill is to think about 1889 and later, Anthony, but allow me that I say just a couple of sentences about the time before. And in that way, I can nicely connect also to what you said, Kiran, because that for, let's say, the trajectory of the Commission, it's very important how this institution was designed and intended to be in the 1950s, because it was indeed a technocratic institution, because also European integration was a technocratic exercise. As you rightfully said, it was about single market, the common agricultural policy, even earlier, about coal and steel integration. It was far away from the political integration that we know nowadays. And so this technocratic institution was a good fit for a technocratic European integration project. So what was needed was, impartial expertise on policy matters, and that is what the Commission delivered. But then, something has changed, and that is when indeed this period of the 1990s, not necessarily the year 1998, but what was important here was the Maastricht Treaty a few years later, because, that is generally discussed as a watershed moment for European integration, because it brought, it made a big leap in the integration process. Suddenly, the EU was doing things that got very close to what we call core state powers, so very close to the stuff that a national state usually does, defense, foreign policy, but also tax issues and so on. So on one hand, massive integration leaps, and then on the other, but also this kind of realization of European citizens that, they don't have so much say about what's happening, or at least not enough. This idea and the notion of the democratic deficit is actually even older. I think the first time this came up was in the 1970s, but in the 1990s, it became really popular, or let's say it became then really this narrative that we have until today, which has many different readings, but I would say the core of it is that too much power, or let's say much power, was vested in executives and too little in parliaments, because national parliaments had, less say, and had to give much power to their governments. And the European Parliament by that time was not powerful enough yet to balance that out. So that is, where, a lot of the kind of democratic thinking started. Okay, we have an issue in the 1990s, we need to make the EU more democratic. So the most logical thing to do is, of course, to beef up and to empower the only directly elected institution, which is the European Parliament. And that is what happened. So for a long time, the European Parliament has been only an advisory body, and also after the direct, elections have been introduced in '79. It took a long time, but every treaty revision, the Parliament became more and more powerful. And nowadays, we have a very confident Parliament there, and it's sometimes difficult to understand where this institution actually came from. From the very early days of the consultation procedure, where the Parliament literally only had to be consulted over cooperation, and then only since the Treaty of Lisbon we have a situation where in the co-decision procedure, which applies to most of the decisions, the Parliament is really on the same eye level as the Council. Now, we have now a triangle. It used to be Commission and Council for a long time that made the decisions, and now there's a triangle. So that is a big change. But then also, what the Parliament was kind of more empowered with is the scrutiny of the Commission, because in a democracy, it's not only the people voting for their representatives, but it's also important that those representatives then, check the executive, and that, as the last step, inside this executive, the political level can check what the bureaucrats are doing, or the other way around, that the politicians decide and the bureaucrats implement. So this is kind of this delegation chain in a democratic governance system, and accountability runs in the other way. And that we also see in the European Commission and the European Parliament. We see that the European Parliament actually more and more controlled the Commission. So we have now a situation that before taking office, and we saw it last year, before taking office, the Parliament votes on the Commission President. I'm sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, something was freezing here. Okay, no, that's good. Okay, so before taking office, the Parliament votes on the Commission President, and then later also when the college is decided, there's another vote in the Parliament before the Commission even takes office. And then during the Commission's term, there are multiple instruments that the Parliament has at its disposal to also control. So they can ask parliamentary questions, and they can invite commissioners and the president to the plenary, for instance, or commissioners to the committees and question, why are you doing this, and what are your plans for the future on this and this issue. So we see that, it's not perfect, but there is a lot of development that has happened. And then also we see informal, or I shouldn't say informal, but let's say we see other efforts. For instance, if you have followed that the framework agreement between the Parliament and the Commission, where the Parliament also tries to, tighten the accountability grip on the institution. Now, inside, that is the last. So we have the power of the Parliament over legislation and budgetary rights. We have the scrutiny over the Commission by the Parliament, but also, and that is then again the last step of this delegation chain, we see that also there was a lot of improvement inside the Commission, because, as I said, it is important in a democratic governance system that those decisions that politicians make, the democratically made decisions for action, that they are also implemented on, the lower echelons of an institution, so the administration. And there we also see a lot of improvement in the last 15 or 20 years even. Now, we see under the current president, and I mean, Desmond, you alluded to, or you spoke about leadership, and you are right that, there is no such one leader in the European Union as we know from national systems. But yet, of course, I think the current president has been, let's say, this question, who do I call when I want to speak to Europe? That question has never been so clearly answered as under the current Commission president. I would argue you can criticize it, and we can also talk about whether or not that presidentialization has gone too far. But generally speaking, top-down control is good news for democracy and accountability. Okay, so we see since the 1990s, we see this politicization. And with politicization, I mean political control. That is by the parliament over the commission, and inside the commission of the political level over the bureaucracy. We, of course, also see party politicization. I mean, you cannot give more power to a parliament and then complain that political parties become also more powerful, right? I mean, this is a parliament consists of parties. But what I'm trying to say is that, this improved accountability in and around the commission is good news, right? I would like to two more quick points after I generally think this is a good development. However, we always have to consider that the EU is a unique polity, and so we have two, I would say, conundrums here with this finding. And the first one is that the EU is based on a system of dual legitimacy, and it will remain to be that way. And that is citizens, which are directly represented by the European Parliament, and states, which are represented by the Council and the European Council. And so the conundrum is, I find that we see crazy parliamentarization as described. The Parliament has become much more powerful than 40 years ago. But the EU cannot develop in a full-fledged parliamentary system. There is an end to this trend, because member states will always want to be represented, and there will always be an institution which represents member states and their interests. And the EU will always, or at least maybe in all our lifetime, I guess, remain this kind of three-way institutional setup. And so that means there is a bit of a mismatch, let's see, between this trend and what the EU is. And then another conundrum, what I see inside the Commission, is that this presidentialization does not go well with collegiality. And collegiality means that the College of Commissioners does decisions together and also takes responsibility for decisions taken together. But as we all know, the current president, but also the two presidents before her, were very presidential and took a lot of decisions not necessarily in a collegial manner. So de facto, collegiality is kind of that, but de jure, it is there. It's in the treaties. So there is, again, a bit of a mismatch or a tension between what's in the treaties and between what's practiced at the moment. So, I don't believe in, and Anthony, and we talked about this earlier today, I don't believe in treaties change anytime soon. But if one would open the treaties, then I think that would have to be discussed. What is the future of the Commission? The principle of collegiality was designed for 9 men sitting around the table, because it was de facto only men, and it was 9 because the big member states had 2 commissioners. It was designed for an institution, as I said, that was technocratic in nature and very, very different to what we see nowadays. So let me sum up. The Commission has been transformed, and from a technocratic to a political institution. And maybe let me add, mid-political. I don't mean, partial towards individual member states. Sometimes it has been interpreted as this, but what I mean is political control. It is not necessarily party political, but it's part of it, absolutely. And we see that party politics become more important also for the inner workings of the Commission, which has not been the case for a long, long time. More political control externally and internally, which is, from a perspective of democratic accountability, a healthy development. But it causes these tensions, because while the Commission has been normalized in the sense that it is, in terms of accountability mechanism more akin to national executives, it still operates in a sui generis polity. Let me end here. Thanks.
Many thanks, Sophia. Fascinating insight into the Commission and the issue of executive power. And please, all of those who are online at the moment, do take the opportunity to think of questions that you might want to pose to the panel. Tracy Sauby, my colleague at the European, will be moderating that conversation. But before she does so, I just want to sort of sum up and make a couple of comments myself about the debate so far. I mean, I think there are certain common themes that come out of the conversation that we've just been having. I mean, one is clearly that the European Union is about generating a kind of collective sovereignty and a collective capacity to act, a kind of wider public good. It's not a zero-sum game in which sovereignty is transferred or lost. And that debate, of course, has been absolutely central to advocates and opponents of European integration. But I think there's a growing feeling that what Alan Millward some decades now ago identified as the European rescue of the nation state has increasing validity as Europe faces so many challenges on multiple fronts. And this notion of Europe as a safe harbor, not just for small countries, not just for small member states, but actually for large member states as well, is something which I think has increasing resonance. If you look at the economic and financial difficulties, for example, which France is confronting at the moment, it's difficult to imagine that if France was outside the European Union, and more specifically outside the Eurozone, that it would be having as relatively benign an experience in the financial markets today as one thinks back to the situation back in the 1980s before the single currency, and you see potentially what could have occurred. But also the notion that Europe, more than that, more than just being a safe harbor, has become a kind of economic powerhouse. And I think it's very important, as Kiran was pointing out, to remember that when we think back to 1989, we're talking about before the completion of the single market. And of course, we're talking about a time when it was decided politically to invent a single currency, something which people only 2 or 3 years before that would have considered completely utopian. And on the back of that single market and on that single currency, we found obviously that the European Union has become a much more significant player in the global economy in terms of its trade policy, in terms of its emergence more as a regulatory superpower. Of course, that can be exaggerated, and there's now some pullback against the so-called Brussels effect, which Anu Bradford analysed. But the idea that the European Union isn't still an important standard setter in the world economy, that idea, of course, has no traction. The EU is, and others are waking up to that fact and pushing back against it. Having been in hibernation on the regulatory front for decades, the United States has suddenly decided that it wants to play that game as well. I'd also say, although it wasn't perhaps mentioned by the colleagues on this call, I mean, I would also say that the process of what the French call engrenage should not be underestimated, which is this idea that just the progressive intermeshing over time of policies and of approaches by the member states, some legal, others in terms just of good practice, creates a kind of collective strength, which is often ignored when you just look at the pictures of council meetings or of parliament votes, in which obviously the media will focus on division, whether it's ideological or whether it's between member states. And yet all the time, subliminally, subterraneously rather, there's this process of an increasing interdependence that's created among the member states, which collectively establishes a kind of common strength. But having said that, and I genuinely believe in all of those great strengths and great contributions which the European integration process has made, it's also important to keep in mind one or two limitations or headwinds, if you like, which the EU confronts. I mean, one is the rather lopsided character of the European Union, where it's a very effective legislative and regulatory machine, but in some other areas of state activity, rather more limited. And there's a tendency, therefore, to regard the solution to problems as inherently requiring legislation or regulation, rather than a wider sort of a wider range of particular policy responses. The second is that despite NG, EU, and other developments, the financial resources of the European Union really remain very modest. I mean, we're talking about somewhere between 1% and 2% of GDP. And if you think back to the McDougall report, now 50 years or more ago, 60 years ago, perhaps, that debate about whether or not the EU should consume 5% or 10% of government resources seems utopian. So there needs to be a serious conversation about a European Union, which, if it's going to step up to serious responsibilities and is going to become increasingly significant, needs to be properly funded. And then there's the problem, which Sophia alluded to, of treaty change, and how now with the difficulty of member states envisaging treaty change, after that slew of treaty changes that we saw right the way through from the Single European Act to the Lisbon Treaty, there were hiccups, there were difficulties, there were referendum results on Maastricht and, of course, on the European Constitution, which seemed to set the process back. But at the end of the day, by 2009, you had a really quite coherent EU political system emerging. And now, since then, essentially significant institutional architectural change is being frozen. I mean, that possibility is very, very limited. And so in those core areas of state function, in defense and security, in taxing and spending, in health, education, and welfare, where there's clearly an increasing need for the EU to act, difficulty, in fact, in establishing the necessarily strong legal underpinnings to deliver that. How to get around that problem, and or how to confront it directly by changing the public debate. And then, I mean, again, raised in a way by Sophia's comments about the European Commission, the ambiguity of what executive authority in the European Union is. Is there enough of it? And where is it? Because quite clearly the European Commission doesn't seem to have quite as much executive authority as it requires as an institution, partly because it's not elected, partly also because it now shares executive authority in a way with the European Council, comprised of heads of state and government who clearly have a more obvious source of legitimacy. And how to make that work effectively? Is that a source of strength, that hydra-headed executive, or a diarchy at the top, to quote famous comment concerning the French Fifth Republic, or is it a source of weakness? And we need to think through some of those issues. And then finally, the whole issue, not to revisit European demos, but the whole question of a political community and political legitimacy and party politics. So long as party politics and political choice is primarily structured at national level, how to engage people in a meaningful sense that big European choices are being made at European and supranational level, which they themselves can play an important part in. So, I mean, there are huge numbers of fascinating issues which are raised by the discussion that we've just been launching. And I see already 5 people want to come in with Q&A, so I'm going to hand over at this stage to Tracy.
Thank you very much, Anthony. I think our panelists and yourself have given everyone much food for thought, and I'm sure we'll get more questions in the course of the next 35, 40 minutes. I think I want to start with Julian and Jurgis's question first, though, because it picks up on exactly what you were just talking about at the end there, Anthony. And I think this is primarily to Sophia, but other people might want to come in on it as well. Which is basically how can the EU better address what we're seeing in terms of the erosion of democratic institutions in various member states, and do so at a national level, given its composition and structure. So over to you to start us off, Sophia.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for that question. Yeah, look, I think we should be quite sobered up by now about that situation, because we see that the only instrument that is there to sanction, namely, the famous Article 7 procedure, is basically impossible, because you always have another enfant terrible who would, support the one that should be sanctioned. And, now it used to be Poland and now it's Slovakia. And I think, looking at upcoming elections in, Poland and France in 2027, I think we should be even more worried about Council and European Council constellations in the future. So to be honest, Article 7 is something that we keep on preaching, but I don't think we will see this happening. Other mechanisms of that sort, or let's say there are many ideas on the table, for instance, to lower the threshold, but it requires treaty change. And there we are again in that situation that I don't believe there's political appetite. Also, I do find it quite dangerous at this point in time. So I don't think that is the way to go. I think the answer is the only way that the only solution, or the only thing that works right now, is money. So the financial conditionality seems to be the only pathway that is kind of working, because those states that are breaching rule of law, and I mean the one state that does it the most is highly dependent on the money coming from the EU, from different pots. Now, one more, again, quite pessimistic view on that. Again, we have French elections in 27, and that we might then have for the first time a French president, or a country, a net payer country from that political camp. So that would change the situation quite significantly, because I think France is less dependent on European money, although of course also in a way, but less dependent than Hungary. So I'm sorry, but I don't have a very optimistic answer for this, but these are my 5 cents.
Kiran, please.
Can I briefly come in on this? Again, I completely agree with Sophia. So there is nothing really that I can add basically on when it comes to the present and the future. But maybe, again, in this panel, it's also interesting to look back. I said, again, little could have been done differently or should have been done differently in the past. This is maybe the one thing. And I think that is interesting to look back to the past treaties again, Maastricht Treaty and so on, where I would argue that there was a certain historical optimism that was folded into these treaties, with the idea that once a country becomes a member state, it's got to be a liberal democracy that's going to be good and a nice, happy player forever. And that is something that we only learn now, that this optimism, that once you reach the threshold, you'll stay there or move on and further, was historically proven wrong. So I think there it is also one of the failures to be slightly more realistic when it comes to forms of interacting, and also the downside of not everybody always being good partners. That should have been done differently. But I agree with Sophia that now is probably not the time to change this, because a fundamental treaty reform is probably not in the cards.
Well, that leads me very nicely on to another question. So Federica Inizio is a bit more optimistic than you are, Kiran, and thinks that maybe the member states will come around to seeing the necessity of future treaty reform, particularly with everything that's happening geopolitically. And so he would like to invite our panel to think a little bit more about why you think it's so low possibility that there will be further treaty change. Perhaps I could ask you to start on that, Kiran.
Yes, very happy to. Again, Federica, I would love to share your optimism. And I think, it would be the best solution we could possibly find if there was a major new treaty. Just looking at the situation, divide between the member states and the governments, and also the volatility when it comes to their positions. And I think Sophia in her presentation and also in her last answer has already, reminded us of the problems there. Sorry. I got this cold, so I'm just happy that we're on screens only, that can't be kind of affecting anyone here. I think it's just impossible that member states will agree on something fundamental. I would argue that, again, if you want to look at the history of integration, we're a little bit back into the 1970s, where major treaty reform was also not discussed to the same extent that it was then, as Anthony rightly reminded us, from the mid-1980s into the late 2000s. All these steps of now finally coming up with a new treaty that will find the solution once and for all, which never really fully worked, though the Lisbon Treaty has worked remarkably well over the past 15 years. So I think this idea of and again, use another French word, bricolage, find makeshift solutions, is what we're kind of reduced to or coming back to, which is not as beautiful as having a good new treaty, but I think has also worked in European integration remarkably well. And again, has roots in the 1970s. The academic word for this is differentiated integration, where only some joined certain clubs, if you will, such as the Euro or also Schengen, where not all member states of the European Union are part. And I think this is also what we'll probably see further, and what we're seeing already as we speak, in those policy fields where there is this blockage that Anthony has reminded us of, where kind of fundamental policy changes are probably frozen, and where hence you need kind of clubs and sub-clubs, coalitions of the willing, if you will, who would then work together. So again, back to the question, I think it would be the best of all worlds to have a fundamental treaty reform, but I just don't find it realistic given the politicization and the widespread of opinions and national positions on these issues.
And Desmond, do you want to perhaps come in next?
Yes, I think there are two issues here. One is the desirability of treaty change, and the other is the feasibility of treaty change. I think it's fair to say that treaty change is simply not feasible at the moment. There's no political appetite for it. It requires a huge investment, political investment on the part of member states, which most governments simply are not willing to make at this time. And of course, governments don't want to take the risk of ratification and failure of ratification. In only a few member states, a referendum would be required, but in many member states, I think a referendum would be seen to be politically necessary. And I think governments understandably are concerned about what the outcome of those referendums would be. On the question of the desirability, as a scholar of the European Union and somebody who studied the history of European integration, I would love to see another round of treaty change. But we have to remember that the last round was very, very time consuming. It began with an interesting experiment, the Constitutional Convention, which lasted about 18 months and really was a very good public debate about the direction of European integration. Many of the ideas did not come out of the convention into the constitutional treaty. We know what happened to the constitutional treaty, but almost 90% of that came into the Lisbon Treaty. And I think the Lisbon Treaty is a good, perfectly acceptable constitutional settlement for the European Union at the moment. I think that it has the potential to deal with a lot of the problems which the European Union is facing. And so if you think about what a treaty change might involve and why it might be necessary and why it might be desirable, you can think of, you can look at previous treaty changes and what have they achieved. Kiran, in his opening intervention, spoke about the increasing policy scope of the European community and the European Union over time, and a lot of that was due to treaty change. And undoubtedly, there are policy fields which might be brought formally into the European Union if there were to be another treaty change. But I don't think it's necessary to do that at the moment. Coming to Sophia's intervention, what about institutional change or institutional reform? And Sophia, you were talking specifically about the Commission. We know that the size of the Commission can be changed without treaty change. There's already provision in the existing treaty to reduce the number of commissioners, and I think that is feasible politically now. I think the smaller member states, which were wary of that, having a smaller commission in the past, and Ireland in particular, I think they realised that in terms of the organisation of the Commission, perhaps the time now is, or will shortly be, if there is future enlargement, to reduce the number of commissioners with an arrangement for selecting the commissioners from the member states. And as far as other changes that might seem to be desirable or concerned, I'm thinking in particular of decision making with respect to the common foreign and security policy. And what seems to be a paralysis of decision making within the European Council, in particular with regard to enlargement, and that's related, of course, to a great extent to the so-called Orban effect. The European Council has been very clever at getting around some of these blockages very creatively. In some cases, by taking issues out of the European Union entirely and going the intergovernmental route with, let's say, 26 member states. In other cases, by creative ways of achieving consensus, again, with fewer, I know it sounds contradictory, with fewer member states, but there are ways around that. And President Costa of the European Council is actively exploring such ways. So I think that there are opportunities that exist within the existing treaty framework, and with creative ways of overcoming especially institutional problems at the moment, without having treaty change, which, as I said, I don't think is feasible anyway.
Yeah, I mean, you've got a situation, of course, where the treaty provides certain mechanisms. I think Kiran mentioned enhanced cooperation and differentiated integration. You've also got the passerelle clauses, but they have to be triggered unanimously to move to QMV. You've also got a fast-track treaty reform process, which doesn't require either an intergovernmental conference or a convention to change some of the policy arrangements in the jargon, the TFEU, the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. But again, that still requires unanimity among the member states. But the problem with what Desmond's talking about in terms of going outside the treaties and having some special intergovernmental arrangement, like was done, for example, with the ESM, the European Stability Mechanism, the Fiscal Compact Treaty, is that it makes the EU system increasingly complicated, and that you sort of end up with two EUs. You end up with the classic EU, which is defined, if you like, by the Lisbon arrangements, in which you have normally qualified majority voting, normally you have co-decision with the Parliament, etc., and you have justiciability in the ECJ. And then you have another Europe, which develops in increasingly important areas, but which is both complex and intergovernmental, and essentially beyond the practical democratic control of either the European Parliament or the individual national parliaments. And that's a rather unsatisfactory arrangement, which kind of in a way replicates many of the problems which the original treaty reform process back in the 80s was designed to overcome. So you can't get out of jail completely free by doing it in this sort of ad hoc emergency Europe way.
I mean, if I may, there's also a comment from Graham Bishop about the 28th regime concept as an alternative to treaty change and a means of further and greater integration. And I don't know if anybody would like to comment on that, or if you'd like to leave it there. And equally, Sophia, I'm sure you have something that you want to say on this issue of the challenges of treaty change.
Yeah, just one more sentence on treaty change. And that is that even in a time, so 2-3 years ago, so 2.5 years ago, after the full-scale invasion in Ukraine, Russia's full-scale invasion in Ukraine, there was momentum for enlargement, and that was then often, coupled with the idea of now we could also open the treaty. So some countries wanted enlargement and some wanted treaty change. And so, some analysts, they brought the two together thinking, okay, maybe this could be a good deal. So not even that worked, you see. So I think even this moment that we had, that momentum around 2 years ago, that has passed. And I'm not saying that this is not coming back, of course, but this is how pessimistic I am for political appetite for treaty change, that even if it's combined with enlargement, most member states would just absolutely not up for it.
Thanks, Sophia. We actually have a comment which I'm going to turn into a question around enlargement. This comes from Robert Morland. And he's arguing that one of the biggest failures when it comes to enlargement has been Turkey. Particularly whether or not the obstacles that have been, as he puts it, put in the way of Turkey joining are pushing Turkey into a less democratic direction than it might otherwise have taken. And I would like to, perhaps with your expertise in democracy, Sophia, invite you to at least start us off in responding to that comment, and whether or not you agree that enlargement is one of the reasons why Turkey's gone in the wrong direction, and whether the way that accession discussions with Turkey have gone has been a failure or not.
Look, I'm really not an expert on Turkey, so I'm not going to go into that waters. But I mean, generally speaking, of course, there is this trade-off that we're facing, and not only with Turkey, but with other with other candidate countries, which are, much further, or at least further in the process, and more realistic candidates. That we have to decide, okay, what do we want to do? Do we want to include them, although we have great democratic concerns, and we might, endanger our own, democratic quality internally, but there are geopolitical reasons to not, make them or allow them wander off of us in our direction even more, But, then again, as long as we don't have stronger mechanisms internally, and that is both in terms of decision making, speaking of Desmond, you were alluding to unanimity in foreign affairs, but also in other important areas. I mean, as long as we, one member state can take the whole union hostage for completely other things, I don't think it's a clever way to invite more that might think in similar ways, and even team up with those that are already inside and problematic. And then what I said earlier, the rule of law procedures, I mean, if there is not something that, we can use to come out of this, what you touched upon, Kiran, the Copenhagen dilemma, then I see us, eroding internal, the EU's integrity and democratic quality internally. But again, I'm biased because I'm looking at decision-making procedures, so that is my main focus. And other people that look more into geopolitical strategy, and foreign affairs, they will now tell me that we should, be not so strict on these things for, for other reasons.
Well, let me, if I might, just say that, of course, relations between the European Union and Turkey are fraught, but I would have thought that President Erdogan had put more obstacles in the way to that improving that relationship than had the European Union. We know that the European Union, although it granted Turkey candidacy status, was never keen and is not keen on Turkey becoming a member. We know that President Sarkozy and Chancellor Merkel made that very clear. But at the same time, I think it's a bit unfair to suggest that the problem lies on the European Union side and not also on the side of the President of Turkey.
Thank you very much, Desmond. I think we'll return to treaty change because we have a question from Sebastian Maillard, which is asking about what we might expect to see from different coalitions of the willing, given how difficult treaty change looks. So what might they be able to achieve? Desmond, do you want to start?
Yeah, the premise of this question is, I think, what we all agree, which is that there will not be treaty change, and therefore, what might countries be able to do together? Well, I think here we're landing fairly squarely on security and defense, and the willingness of some countries, and perhaps the ability of some countries, to contribute more to a collective European security and defense policy outside of NATO, or perhaps in cooperation with NATO. And I think that form of differentiated integration is essential if there is to be progress, more progress within or amongst European Union member states in this very important field. And I think that clearly what has been happening in Ukraine over the last few years has made it essential, imperative for Europeans to do more together. I agree with Kiran completely that the idea of an EU army is certainly not feasible. That would be going back to the future, perhaps, because there was an effort to do that a very long time ago, and it did not succeed. In my view, it was a good thing it did not succeed at the time, because it allowed the then member states, only 6, to concentrate on first principles on economic integration. And I think we're not yet at a stage within the European Union, for the European Union as a whole, to grasp the nettle of security and defense, but certainly some countries could. And those countries, I think, must include not just EU member states, but non-member states as well. The United Kingdom and Norway come to mind.
So, Kiran, please.
Sorry, one line. I fully agree with what Des has just said. I think what we also see when it comes to these coalitions, that the whole idea of a Franco-German engine always kind of being the core of European integration, of new projects. And that was the core also when it came to these differentiated form of integration since the 1970s. There was often France and Germany and others then pushing for something like the euro and so on. That is maybe also a thing of the past. Again, Sophia has reminded us of the volatility of the French situation. And I think what we've also seen is how proactive some of the Eastern or Central Eastern European countries have been in recent years. So also in that sense, it's just interesting to see that also the internal landscape of member states and who, again, thinks that more is needed has changed. Also when it comes to security issues, Denmark, as a country that has been traditionally very much against joint debts and so on, has also changed its position. So in that sense, there is also new dynamism. And I think what we'll see is also different geometries, probably on different kind of questions. Again, I would agree with Anthony that this only makes understanding the European integration process and the European Union much more difficult. But that is probably bring us back to the conundrum that Sophia has mentioned, that you can have efficiency or you can have legitimacy. And having both at the same time is something the European Union has been struggling with forever. And probably there is not going to be an easy way out. I would love to see that. But again, in these messy times that remind me of policy making in the 1970s, I would tend to prioritize further progress on some policies than beauty and transparency in a building that's probably never going to materialize.
I'd like to pick up on that thread because we've got a couple of questions and comments which touch around the issue of EU hard power. And our panelists seem to be in agreement about the unlikelihood of an EU army. And Desmond mentioned the possibility of kind of stepping into the gap left that's being left by America with NATO and what might happen there. We've, as I say, we've got a couple, and so to combine them, I guess the question is, what sort of more mature relationship, to borrow Edward Macmillan Scott's phrase, might we expect to see between the EU institutions and NATO going forward, on the one hand, and to what extent have we reached some of the limits of projecting European hard power, and can they be surmounted? And I'm not sure who would like to take that one first.
Well, and let me just add a comment. There was a fascinating article yesterday in the Financial Times about military mobility in Europe, and if you haven't had a chance to read it, I would strongly urge you to do so, which in a way proves the point about the division of labor which can emerge between NATO and the EU, because it takes apparently 45 days to get certain types of military kit from Antwerp to Ukraine as a result of the difficulty, some of which are to do with regulatory difficulties, but many are just physical problems in terms of traveling across motorways, bridges, tunnels, whatever it might be. The EU is in an extremely strong position to try to provide a coherent response, at least a coordinated response to this, using funds which it has available, and is beginning to do so, which is very welcome. So that's a good example. The EU, of course, is also the regulatory agency in respect of cybersecurity, in respect of all sorts of communications technology, which is going to be indispensable from the point of view of the delivery of it. It seems to me the real hard power problem is a rather different one, which is to do with the so-called strategic enablers. I mean, if the European Union is going to be serious about its own defense, it has to start investing over a very long period of time with a very large amount of money in things like heavy lift, long-range bombers, satellite technology, you name it, which the Americans, and command and control systems, of course, which the Americans have dominated so far, and which has been absolutely at the core of the NATO system, but essentially provided by the United States. So that's a big political choice which is now looming. And it seems to me that there's a certain amount of reluctance to address the difficulty of that. And there's obviously a rearguard action within NATO itself, in which people want to say, don't worry, it's all going to be all right on the night. The Americans are never going to pull the plug. And then there's the strategic autonomy proposition, which is, well, we can't actually be sure of that. We need to be in a position where we can do it ourselves. But to do it ourselves is going to be extremely costly and politically also quite problematic. So I think that's at the core of this hard power issue. And then there's something, we had European lecture, their first annual European lecture in Berlin a couple of weeks ago at the Freie Universität Berlin, in which one of the speakers was Joschka Fischer. And he said that underpinning all of this is the question of the will to power, if you like. Is there an actual willingness to use hard power? And if so, how do you organize and mobilize that inside EU structures and more widely? So there's very big issues here.
And I would just add that that lecture is now available on our YouTube channel if anybody is interested. Would any of our other panelists like to weigh in on this issue of EU hard power and relationship with NATO? Kiran, please.
Just very briefly, I think, again, Anthony has given a fantastic answer covering many dimensions. I think it boils down to an even more fundamental category, and that is trust amongst the member states. So I was at a conference last week in Bremen where the German ambassador to the European Union was making the statement that if you just look at the mess, if you will, that is being created between Germany and France at the moment about the idea of a joint fighter plane, FCAS, which is probably not going to materialize because national industrial policies and a lack of trust between the various players, also for fear of industrial espionage, is keeping them from doing this. One really needs to think about also more, maybe more radical versions of division of labor. And the question that he put on the table was, would the member states accept that France, for instance, would be in charge of the fighter plane and the Germans would be doing the tank system? That might be a solution that would work, but probably many in these two countries who would then be sitting on the wrong side of the fence would be up in arms. And that just shows that despite these decades of close cooperation amongst politicians, experts, bureaucrats, and so on, and also industrial leaders, there is still reluctance to really join forces on some things. And in that sense, I think to some extent, what we're witnessing is that the pressure, the crisis hasn't become big enough, if you will, at least in the perception of people, to really opt for more radical measures and to join forces more fundamentally. And again, I think what we need is kind of creative solutions where there is a division of labor between NATO and the European Union. And Anthony has given great examples there, but maybe also more fundamental discussion on whether in these collisions of the willing and these variable geometries, there is then maybe also more of a division of labor, that it's not always everybody doing everything together, or also even coalitions doing things together, but also delegating to some parties that would then be doing things for the community, or at least their coalition as a whole.
I would just add very briefly the question of cost. I think the European Union has overcome its deep-rooted philosophical reservation or reluctance to use hard power. So I think philosophically there is an acceptance of in the world which we now face of the need to use hard power, but there's not yet an acceptance about paying for that. And I think this may be related to Kiran's point about the fact that we don't yet feel a sense of urgency or of crisis. I'm struck how often I hear, I'm in Europe at the moment, that Europe is at war. I don't feel it here. I don't sense that, because ordinary people certainly in their everyday lives, I think, may say that as a statement of support for Ukraine, but I don't think they mean it in terms of their willingness to put their hands in their pockets and pay additional taxes of the kind that would be necessary for European countries, individually, collectively, within the EU or outside, to develop the kind of hard power that is becoming increasingly necessary.
Can I say one sentence on that? This Europe is at war rhetoric, I understand it often also used by leaders purposefully to justify crisis decision-making. We see this with the Commission president. I mean, she says it in every speech, and it gets worse and worse. I have the feeling that she, wants to, she gives this sense of urgency. I understand it is an urgent situation, but of course, crises become to the new normal. Where does the crisis end? And so, also when it comes to, we also talked about this earlier, when it comes to the involvement of the parliament and, the usage of Article 122, which is a procedure which excludes the parliament from decision-making, which has been used a lot lately, exactly with that argument. We are at war, we are in an emergency situation, so we got to do it all really quick. So I think it's also a bit sometimes of a pretext of leaders.
Yes, and that actually brings us nicely into another question, which I wanted to direct primarily to you, Sophia, and I think Anthony may want to come in on this as well. Which is from Peter Price, who asks, if we move to more intergovernmental decision-making to overcome blocking states, is there a way to ensure that we retain the influence of the European Parliament?
Well, the quick answer is no. I mean, that is the whole point. No? I mean, intergovernmental decision-making excludes the European Parliament completely. and makes it also for national parliaments very difficult, because much happens behind closed doors and is intransparent, and any kind of democratic accountability is very difficult. And I mean, let me say, maybe connecting to it, it's a point that I wanted to make earlier also when I heard your interventions, Desmond and Kiran, because you were both quite optimistic, and I totally agree. And I'm very happy to hear also, a positive take. And you both also highlighted, how far we've come and the strength of the EU. But I mean, maybe one word of worry, which we kind of alluded to here and there, but which I think is very important to keep in mind is the rise of far-right power and parties across all member states almost, and across all EU institutions. I mean, if we look at, we talked about the European Council and about, elections. I mean, there's many elections coming up, but, I'm always stressing Poland and France, because there's really far-right parties that could actually come in power again and make quite a difference in the European Council constellation. In the Council, we have at the moment 9 out of 27 member states where far-right parties are either junior or senior partner of the government, and are actively involved in decision-making. And, in the Council, there is no cordon sanitaire, so they are making an impact there. And then in the European Parliament, we have not only, and I mean, last week, the decision on the omnibus made a very, very strong point on that. We have, since the last European Parliament election, not only more representative of far-right parties, but we have a whole new situation, because the European People's Parties, the Conservatives, they suddenly are willing to make deals with them, and they give them loads of power, and they themselves have professionalized, those, what is now called the Patriots for Europe, which was the ID group before, used to be, a protest group. I mean, they came to plenary, and I mean, Anthony, you know this better than I do. They came to plenary for their 1-minute speeches, to have snippets for their social media appearance, and that was basically it. They got the money and they went home. But now they understand the parliamentary game, it seems. I mean, from what I hear from these first, a bit more of a year now of active parliamentary procedures and of this term, it seems that they do the work now. They want to have rapporteurships, they get rapporteurships, also of quite important files. And again, as we saw last week, together with the EPP, they now even have decision-making power.
Is there anything you want to add to that, Anthony, before I ask what I believe will be the last question?
Not particularly. I mean, I think that Sophia's analysed the situation very well. I mean, of course, it's an extremely complex political situation, because the EPP felt that it was in some kind of that it was being held hostage to some degree by the parties of the centre-left. And their line will be, and is, look, we just vote for our position, and if others choose to join us, that's their affair. But of course, the process of intermingling and interconnection grows all the time. And the reality is that, I don't know exactly what percentage, but about 30% of the European Parliament is now comprised of people who in the old days were totally marginal figures. And the question is, for any parliament, how do you deal with that? That's not a specific issue for the European Parliament, but it's coming into relief in the EU political system for the first time. And as indeed Sophia says, there's a sort of slightly different situation both in the Council and in the Parliament on this. I actually think that one of the bigger questions, which is not really addressed in all of this, is you have a situation where both in the Commission and in the Council, the EPP has become absolutely the dominant force. I forget the exact figures, but I think 15 commissioners out of 27 in the European Commission come from the EPP, whereas the EPP in the European elections only got around a quarter of the vote. Now, I'm somebody who hails from the EPP, so of course I'm quite sympathetic, if you like, to their political view, but that does seem to be rather disproportional. And of course, you've got the situation where the majority of governments in the Council likewise are headed by the EPP. So this power sharing thing is not just a matter of a power play inside the European Parliament, it's also a situation in the other political institutions of the EU, which needs to be thought through somewhat.
So we have a question from Yuri Kunaz, and he actually asked it very early, but I've been saving it for the end because I think it's a very nice forward-looking note to end on. Nuri says that if he's not mistaken, Kiran, you've argued elsewhere that it seemed quite unlikely in 1945 that the EU might become a major player. And based on what you've all said today, I'd like to invite all of the panelists, perhaps starting with Kiran, to speculate on what you think is something that seems like an unlikely development right now, but which may nonetheless come to pass in, say, the next 25 to 50 years.
Wow, that's a big one. Hey, thank you. Thank you so much for that, Nuri. Again, I think what we've already said is quite important, that we tend to look at the European Union in short kind of rhythms and cycles, and then crises always dominate. And what we tend to forget is that incrementally, as a result of many of these crises, we could talk about the Eurozone crisis, we talk about the pandemic and so on, very often, not in all policy fields, but in quite a few of them, the European Union has incrementally gained further powers. So I would not imagine that maybe something big, one big thing that we didn't see so far will emerge, but rather that we'll see many more small little things emerge further. That is quite likely. And I think in order not to sound too positive and optimistic, the question still is into which direction this will pivot. Because I would agree with what has been said before also by Sophia just a second ago, that the power also of far-right parties, governments and so on is horribly strong, I should say, and that the European Union is to some extent also is quite vulnerable to be turned into something that they could also use for their purposes. And we see that to some extent already in migration policies. So in that sense, the kind of values that we try to or tend to associate with the European Union could also be marginalized even further. So in that sense, I think what we'll certainly see is further change, new dynamics of European integration, but whether they're necessarily positive, I think is up in the cards. And it also has to do with, again, something what Sophia just said, with national elections in some of the key member states over the next years, where I think it is absolutely open what they will bring. And the only thing we can hope for is many Europeans being interested in the European Union, taking it seriously, and that these conversations, as we're having them today, will have an impact on the kind of debates that we'll have across Europe, also on the future of the European Union.
Sophie, would you like to come in next?
Yeah, I mean, I love the European Union, and I would love it to see it, stronger and more supranational. I'm a little worried though, and that connects to what Kiran just said and what I also mentioned earlier with the far right representation. The tide is. I mean, it seems that things are going not in the direction that I personally would like to go. See things to go, and none of the far right parties is actively anymore. After Brexit, advertising for leaving the European Union. However, they all talk about, changing within, or the AfD. I mean, certainly the most radical at the moment. They speak about, I mean, one of them was quoted on saying that, the EU has to die so that the real Europe can live. And, if I hear things like this, then, yeah, I don't want to imagine what kind of European Union these parties have in mind. But it, in the very best case, for sure, doesn't go much further than, single market integration and, economic aspects, but all of the political integration on key aspects that were also outlined by Kiran in the very beginning. I think these things are really at danger, because indeed, just because we achieved them once doesn't mean that they would continue, or that we are even able to hold them.
Well, the discussion has become really about the future of the European Union rather than development of a particular idea or policy, and taking the broad theme. An ever closer union, well, I would say that. An ever stronger union, an ever larger union, definitely. But I'll pick up on one word. I think Anthony introduced it into the discussion, and that's complexity. I think an ever more complex union. And we have to get used to that. And we would all love to simplify the European Union, not least because one of the things we do is to try to teach people about the European Union, and it's a very difficult subject. But I think the European Union will become more complex, and the complexity, of course, is a barrier that makes it difficult for the European Union to connect to ordinary citizens. I think it takes an effort to try to understand the European Union. It's almost impossible to love the European Union unless you're somebody like us who has a vested interest in the subject. But for ordinary people, I think the European Union will always remain somewhat distant and not just complex, but increasingly so.
Anthony, I don't know if you want to weigh in.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a kind of debate about whether the European Union is a kind of service provider or whether it's a destiny shared in common. And, you know, an awful lot of people don't think about the EU and just take for granted what the EU offers and the freedoms which it extends and the prosperity which it generates. And others see the European Union as very much the future with a capital F. I myself, for what it's worth, very much believe that there is a destiny shared in common. I think I don't know about you, but whenever I go outside outside Europe, not just the European Union, I really feel European. Even in the United States, one feels so strongly European by contrast. And that, I think, is a consciousness which, if only could be more widely shared, would enable us to take difficult decisions together and feel that we were part of a common political community in a real and meaningful sense. But maybe this is a good moment in which to wrap up the conversation, to thank our colleagues, to thank Sophia, to thank Desmond, to thank Kiran, to thank Tracy for so expertly moderating the discussion, to thank Sasha behind the scenes under European events, and to say that we'll be coming back with another seminar in this series of online alumni seminars from the European in the new year, and to wish everybody a most enjoyable festive season. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.